A guy named Tyler, late 20s, well put together, genuinely kind, told me something last year that I haven't stopped thinking about. He said, "I haven't approached a woman in person in over 2 years. Not because I don't want to, I just stopped seeing the point." He wasn't bitter, he wasn't angry, he was just done. And the scariest part? He couldn't fully explain why. That moment stuck with me because Tyler isn't some outlier. He's a pattern. Walk into any social space right now. A bar, a gym lobby, a bookstore, a coffee shop, and you'll notice the same thing. Men and women occupying the same physical space, surrounded by genuine opportunity, and almost zero actual initiation happening between them. It's not that people don't want connection. Something else is going on, something quieter and, honestly, much more interesting. This channel, Brutal Relationship, exists for exactly this kind of conversation. The stuff people feel but rarely say out loud, laid out plainly without the performance. 7 reasons, each one connected to something real in human psychology. Each one more layered than the headline suggests. Let's go. Reason 1. The risk calculation completely shifted. For most of history, the social math of approaching someone was relatively simple. You walk up, you express interest. One of 2 things happens. Either there's a connection or there isn't. If it doesn't land, the moment fades. You move on. The downside was limited and temporary. That math has been rewritten, not dramatically, not overnight. But steadily, the potential consequence of an unwanted approach has expanded beyond the moment itself. Men are increasingly aware, consciously or not, that a misjudged approach can become a story. It can get shared. It can attach a label that follows someone. The actual probability of that happening is low for most men in most situations. But probability isn't what drives avoidance. Vivid possibility does. The brain doesn't assess risk statistically. It assesses it emotionally, and when the emotional worst-case scenario gets vivid enough, even from watching it happen to someone else, behavior starts adjusting to protect against it. This is called threat appraisal in psychology, and it operates below conscious awareness. You don't decide to stop approaching. You just find reasons not to start. What's worth examining, honestly and without defensiveness, is whether the fear you're carrying comes from something that actually happened to you or from a worst-case scenario you've absorbed secondhand. Because those require completely different responses. One is experience, the other is borrowed anxiety. And most men, if they're truthful, are carrying far more of the second kind than the first. The move forward. Get specific about what you're actually afraid of. Not a vague sense of it could go wrong, but the specific concrete outcome you're bracing for. Most of the time, when you name it precisely, it loses about 60% of its power immediately. Reason 2. An entire generation was never actually taught. How to do this? Nobody talks about this one enough. And it might be the most consequential factor of all. There's a generation of men who received completely contradictory instructions growing up. From one direction, be confident, be bold, express what you want. From another direction, every specific behavior that historically looked like confidence, making the first move, being direct, expressing interest early, was getting socially reframed as something potentially problematic. The result wasn't a new playbook, it was paralysis. Men didn't learn a better set of behaviors. They just lost faith in the old ones, with nothing to replace them. And when someone lacks genuine skill in something, but also feels like they should already know how to do it, they avoid it entirely rather than risk looking incompetent. Psychologists document this constantly. It's not cowardice, it's ego protection. You can't fail at something you never attempt. And if you were never taught properly in the first place, avoidance feels much safer than exposure. Most men in their mid-20s today have never had a real conversation with someone they respected who said, "Here's what it actually looks like to express genuine interest in a person, with clarity, without pressure, without it being weird." That conversation almost never happens. So men either pick up crude tactical nonsense from the internet, freeze completely, or oscillate between both. Meanwhile, the information environment is deafening. More content about dating exists now than ever before in human history. And somehow, people are more confused and less confident than the generations who had none of it. That should tell you something about the quality of what's being consumed. The actual path forward, reduce the mission to something honest and manageable. The goal of walking up to someone isn't to secure a date or a number. It's to find out whether this particular person is someone you genuinely enjoy a conversation with. That's it. When the outcome you're managing toward is curiosity instead of conquest, the whole energy of it changes. And so does how it lands. Reason 3. Apps rewired. How men perceive women in physical spaces. Be real about what swiping did. Not in theory, but in practice. When dating apps became the dominant mode of meeting people, they offered a particular promise: volume, efficiency, low stakes. And for a small slice of users, that promise was partially delivered. For the majority, what actually happened was something more psychologically significant. They got trained. Swipe long enough, and the brain starts cataloging people rather than encountering them. Not because of some character flaw, because that's literally what the interface rewards. Fast visual judgment, rapid filtering, next. And that mental habit doesn't clock out when you close the app. It follows you into physical spaces. The man who has been on apps for 3 years walks into a room and unconsciously runs the same algorithm: scan, assess, move on. Except in real life, there's no profile, no bio, no curated photos. And because real people are less filterable than profiles, they actually start feeling less accessible, even though they're standing 3 feet away. There's also something called the paradox of choice at work here. Research consistently shows that the more options a person perceives themselves to have, the harder each individual decision becomes, and the less satisfied they feel with any choice they do make. Men juggling multiple apps simultaneously aren't more likely to connect meaningfully. They're more likely to feel vaguely unsettled by every interaction because some layer of their brain is always holding out for the next option. Real-world approach requires presence. It requires treating the person in front of you as complete and worth your full attention, not one of 900 profiles you could have opened instead. Apps don't train that. They train the opposite: worth trying. 1 week, no apps. Not as a punishment, as a recalibration. Pay attention to how your perception of the people around you shifts when they're no longer competing with a digital catalog. Reason 4. Men notice the gap between what's said and what gets a response. This is uncomfortable to say plainly, but it needs to be said. There is a documented gap between what people report wanting in a partner and what they actually respond to when a real person is in front of them. This isn't a criticism of any gender. Behavioral psychology has shown this pattern across virtually every population studied. Self-reported preferences are aspirational. Instinctive responses are biological and emotional. These are different operating systems, and they don't always agree. But when a man repeatedly hears that kindness, emotional availability, and genuine respect are what women want, and then watches something very different seem to work in practice, he doesn't usually arrive at the nuanced psychological conclusion. He arrives at the simpler, more painful one. None of this makes sense, and trying is pointless. Wrong conclusion, but an understandable one when no one hands you the actual framework. The framework is this: attraction and compatibility run on separate tracks. Attraction is rapid, instinctive, and driven by signals: confidence, direction, energy, presence. Compatibility is slow, contextual, and only becomes visible over time through consistency and character. Most women genuinely want the qualities they describe, but those qualities live on the compatibility track. If a man doesn't produce enough of the right signal to get past the initial threshold, the compatibility never gets a chance to surface. This is not a call to perform confidence you don't feel. It's a call to actually develop the things that generate real confidence: a sense of direction in your own life, standards you hold yourself to, engagement with the world beyond dating. Those internal realities broadcast externally without any performance required. The practical adjustment: stop trying to be everything at once. Build a life you're genuinely invested in. People who are absorbed in something real, a craft, a goal, a project, give off a completely different energy than people who are primarily focused on whether they're coming across well. Reason 5. A content ecosystem built on male rejection, anxiety. Something is happening in the media environment that deserves to be named directly. There is a genre of content across multiple platforms that is specifically engineered around moments of male social failure, approaches gone wrong, public rejections, humiliating interactions. These videos generate massive engagement because they trigger a powerful emotional response. And because the algorithm rewards that engagement, they get served up constantly to men who are already thinking about dating. Watch enough of it and something insidious happens. Your brain starts treating these outlier moments as representative data. You've never personally had an approach end that way, but you've watched it happen 60 times. And the brain, at the gut level, doesn't fully distinguish between witnessed experience and lived experience, especially when the emotional intensity is high and the repetition is relentless. This is vicarious conditioning. You can develop genuine fear responses to situations you've never personally been in purely through observed exposure, the same mechanism that makes you physically tense watching someone almost fall from a ledge. Your nervous system responds to the emotional reality of it, not the factual distance from it. So, a portion of male dating hesitation isn't rooted in personal experience at all. It's manufactured anxiety, packaged into content, monetized by people who profit from you staying in a state of low-level fear and scrolling for reassurance. The counter-move is an audit, not dramatic, just honest. Look at what you've been consuming about relationships for the last 3 to 6 months. Has it made you feel more capable and clear? Or more anxious, more suspicious, more convinced the whole thing is rigged against you? Content that consistently produces the second set of feelings isn't informing you, it's conditioning you. And you can choose to feed a different input. Reason 6. Not approaching protects a story. More than it avoids pain. This is the one that cuts deepest, and it's the one most people skip past. For a lot of men, the real function of not approaching isn't actually to avoid rejection. It's to protect a particular belief about themselves. Specifically, the belief that they would be wanted if they tried. As long as you don't approach, that belief stays intact, untested, safe. You hold on to the comfortable idea that you could connect with someone if you really went for it. The moment you approach and it doesn't go the way you hoped, you now have evidence. And collecting evidence that threatens your self-image is something the brain goes to extraordinary lengths to avoid. Psychologists call this self-handicapping. It's thoroughly documented. The student who doesn't study, so the grade can be blamed on preparation rather than ability. The person who never sends the application, so the rejection can be blamed on timing. The man who never approaches, so he never finds out what she actually thinks of him. Non-action masquerades as safety. But it's a very expensive form of comfort because it requires staying smaller than you actually are to keep the illusion protected. Here's the part that stings. The men most prone to this pattern are usually the ones who are most self-aware, most emotionally intelligent, most likely to feel deeply. Those same traits, turned outward rather than in on themselves, are exactly what create genuine, meaningful connection with another person. The sensitivity that's making them hesitate is the same quality that would make them worth knowing. The reframe that actually helps. Stop measuring success by her response. Measure it by your own integrity in the moment. Did you show up honestly without manipulation, without desperation, without performing someone you're not? That's the win, regardless of the outcome. An honest interaction that doesn't go anywhere is infinitely more valuable than a lifetime spent carefully avoiding the test. Reason 7, the conversation about standards. Got loud, and both sides stopped listening. The last reason is the most culturally tangled, so stay with it. Right now, there's a very public, very high-volume conversation happening about expectations in dating. From one side, more self-respect, higher standards, refusing to settle, knowing what you bring to the table. From the other, feeling invisible, undervalued, priced out of a market that wasn't designed with them in mind. Both conversations have legitimate roots. Both contain real pain. And both sides have largely retreated into separate corners of the internet, consuming content that validates their frustration and confirms the other group is the problem. The psychological effect of this is predictable. When you spend enough time absorbing content that frames the opposite gender as unreasonable, incompatible, or not worth the effort, you start treating real individuals as stand-ins for a group. You walk into a room and you're not really seeing the specific person in front of you. You're seeing a representative of a category you've been primed to resent or distrust. And genuine connection becomes nearly impossible in that state because it requires actually seeing someone, not a projection of everyone you've been warned about. This matters because attraction and polarization cannot coexist. Not real attraction, the kind that actually leads somewhere. You can't be genuinely open to a person while simultaneously defending against what you've decided they probably are. Standards aren't the problem. Knowing what you want, being honest about your values, refusing to ignore red flags. None of that is the problem. The problem is when that healthy self-knowledge hardens into a posture that screens out human beings before they've had a chance to be human in front of you. The adjustment worth making. Next time you notice yourself categorizing someone before you've exchanged a single real word, catch it. Not to shame yourself, just to notice it, and then try, even briefly, to encounter that person as a specific individual with a specific story, because that's all any of us actually are, and it's the only ground on which anything real ever gets built. What's actually happening underneath all of this? You stayed with all 7. Good. Because here's the thread running through every single one. Men didn't stop approaching because they stopped wanting closeness. They stopped because the perceived cost, social, emotional, psychological, climbed above the expected return. And that threshold was pushed higher by a combination of shifted cultural dynamics, algorithmically amplified fear, a generational gap in honest emotional education, and a media landscape that profits from division more than connection. None of these reasons are anyone's villain origin story. They're just patterns. And patterns, once you can see them clearly, lose a significant amount of their grip over you. The actual collapse isn't happening in the dating market. It's happening in people's willingness to be genuinely open with another human being, to risk being known, without a guarantee of how it will go. That's always been the hardest part. It just looks different now, because the environment around it has changed so dramatically. Tyler, from the start of this video, eventually told me he'd started walking up to people again. Not with a strategy, not with a goal, not with his ego on the line, just with honest curiosity about the person in front of him. He said it felt completely different this time. It does. It always does when you strip the performance out of it. That's the whole thing, honestly. And it was always that simple. Not easy, but simple. Show up, be present, see who's actually there. Everything else is just noise you can choose to stop feeding.